All right, welcome back to Cheating Lady Flies. You know, most people assume that when a marriage ends, the person holding the papers has the power. Like whoever initiates the ending automatically wins something, controls something. Like the act of handing someone a document means you've already decided how the rest of the story goes. Hannah Morgan believed that. She believed it completely. And here's the thing about people who hand you divorce papers with a smirk on their face. They've already written the next scene in their head. They know exactly how you're supposed to react. They've rehearsed it. They've imagined your face falling apart, your voice cracking, maybe a little begging, maybe a lot of begging. They've built this entire moment around your collapse. The smirk isn't accidental. It's a costume. It's the face you wear when you're absolutely certain you know what happens next. Hannah was certain. She was wrong. I need to back up, because the divorce papers weren't the beginning. They were just the moment everything became undeniable. The beginning was quieter than that. The beginning always is. Hannah and I had been married for 6 years when I first noticed something shift. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to and say, there, that's where it started. It was more like a frequency change, like a sound you've been hearing your whole life suddenly drops half a note and you can't unhear it. We met in our late 20s. I was working in logistics management. Not glamorous, but stable, good money, steady trajectory. Hannah was in marketing at a mid-size agency downtown. We were both practical people, or at least I thought we were. We got married after 2 years of dating, bought a house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, put a dog in the backyard, the whole setup. For the first 3 years it was good, actually good, not just fine. We argued sometimes, sure, but nothing that didn't resolve. We had a rhythm. Dinners on Sundays, friends over occasionally, a vacation every summer. Then year 4 came around and something softened. Not between us, in her. Like a wall went up somewhere and I was suddenly on the outside of it without knowing when the construction started. At the time, I blamed it on stress. Hannah had taken on a bigger role at the agency, more responsibility, longer hours. That made sense, I accepted it. But there were small things, small enough to dismiss on their own. She started coming home later. Not every night, maybe 2-3 times a week. Always with a reason. Late client meetings, a campaign deadline, drinks with the team to decompress. Each one individually sounded completely reasonable. Hannah had always been career-driven. I wasn't the type to question her schedule. At least, that's what I was supposed to believe. The first time I noticed something that didn't sit right, it wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday evening in March. Hannah had texted me around 5 saying she'd be home late, drinks with a client. Fine, I made dinner for myself, watched some TV, waited. She got home around 10:30, which wasn't unusual, but she was off. Not drunk, not guilty looking exactly. Just slightly recalibrated, like she'd had to put herself back together before walking through the door and had done a pretty solid job of it. Almost perfect, actually. She kissed me on the cheek, said the client. Dinner ran long, dropped her bag by the couch, and went upstairs to shower. I didn't say anything. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. Because what was I going to say? You seem slightly recalibrated? That's not a conversation. That's not even a suspicion, really. That's just a feeling that something's a few degrees off from where it should be. So I let it go. Here's the thing about letting small things go. It works, right up until it doesn't. And the longer you let them go, the more you've trained yourself to look away. I'd gotten pretty good at looking away by that point. I'm not proud of that. I'm just being honest. A few weeks later, she mentioned someone from work, casually. The way you mention someone who's completely unremarkable and deserves no particular attention. His name was Derek. He'd recently joined the agency as a creative director. Smart guy, she said. Really talented, good energy on the team. I nodded, filed it away, thought nothing of it. Which, sure, that makes sense. People mention coworkers all the time. It's normal conversation. I wasn't about to become the guy who raises an eyebrow every time his wife says a man's name. But here's what I noticed. She didn't mention him again after that. Not once. You'd think someone who was smart, talented, good energy on the team would come up more than once in casual conversation. People talk about their coworkers constantly. The ones they like, the ones they don't, the ones who are funny, the ones who are annoying. After that one introduction, Derek ceased to exist in Hannah's stories about work. Nothing obvious, just enough to feel off. The dog, a 4-year-old beagle named Scout, started sleeping on her side of the bed more, which sounds completely irrelevant. It probably is. But I remember noticing it because Scout had always been my dog in the way that dogs decide who they belong to. He'd always defaulted to me. That spring, he started gravitating toward Hannah, following her room to room, sleeping at her feet. I made a joke about it once. "What, am I not good enough anymore?" Hannah laughed. Scout wagged his tail. I moved on. But something about that small shift stuck with me in a way I couldn't explain. Dogs read energy. Everyone knows that. They respond to whatever's happening in the room emotionally, even when no one else is paying attention. Scout was picking up on something. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was reading into a dog's sleeping preferences, and I might have been right. I'd been wrong before. I'll get to that. About 2 years into our marriage, I'd convinced myself Hannah was seeing someone from her gym. There was a guy she mentioned once or twice. They'd exchanged texts about workout schedules, and she started going to the gym at weird hours. I built a whole case in my head, stayed up late thinking about it, got tense and distant for a couple of weeks before I finally just asked her directly. She looked at me like I'd said something genuinely insane, pulled out her phone, showed me the texts, all completely mundane, scheduling stuff, and told me the guy had just started dating her coworker and had been asking her advice about it. I felt like an idiot. I apologized. She forgave me, but it took a few days for the air to clear. After that, I swore I'd never let paranoia drive me again. I'd require actual evidence before I started building cases in my head, which is probably exactly what Hannah was counting on now that I think about it. By early summer, the pattern had settled into something regular. She was distracted in the evenings, not cold. Hannah was never cold. She was too smart for that. She was warm enough, present enough, attentive enough that nothing felt alarming. But there was a layer of glass between us that hadn't been there before. Like I was watching a very convincing performance of my wife rather than actually being with her. Conversations felt slightly scripted. Not all of them, just the ones where she was redirecting. Whenever I asked about her day in specifics, the answers were smooth, too smooth. The kind of smooth that comes from having already prepared what you're going to say. I'd catch her on her phone sometimes, and she'd set it face down immediately. Not in an obvious, guilty way, in a practiced, casual way that looked like habit, like it had become second nature to flip it over when I walked into the room. I started paying attention without letting on that I was paying attention. Not snooping, just watching. The way you watch something when you're not sure what you're looking at yet, but you know something's there. In June, she told me she had a work conference in Cincinnati. 2 nights, Thursday through Saturday. She showed me the conference website, mentioned a few sessions she was planning to attend, named a coworker who'd be sharing a room with her to save on costs. I said, "Sounds good, I'll hold down the fort." She smiled, packed her bag Friday morning. I didn't say anything about the fact that the coworker she mentioned, a woman named Priya, had posted Instagram photos from a rooftop bar in Columbus on Friday night. Cincinnati is 90 minutes from Columbus. So either Priya drove back from a work conference she was supposedly attending on a Friday night to go out in Columbus, or Hannah was in Cincinnati alone. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't confront her when she came home Sunday. She seemed relaxed, rested, slightly glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months. "How was the conference?" I asked. "Really productive," she said. I needed that. I'll bet she did. Here's what I knew by July. I wasn't paranoid. I want to be precise about that because it matters. After the gym situation 2 years earlier, I'd developed a habit of checking myself. Every time I noticed something, I'd run it through a filter. Is this real, or am I constructing something? I genuinely learned to second-guess my instincts. But there's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. Paranoia builds a case out of nothing. Pattern recognition follows data that keeps pointing in the same direction. The data kept pointing. Late returns became more regular. Not every week, but predictable in a way that felt structured. Tuesdays and Thursdays, fairly consistently. Always a reason. Always work-related. Always slightly different enough that no single excuse repeated itself too obviously. Convenient timing. She started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, always around 9, always back by noon. This was new. Hannah had never been a Saturday morning gym person. She'd been a weekday evening gym person for as long as I'd known her. The change happened gradually enough that it almost registered as normal. Almost. I asked her about it once, casually. "When did you start doing Saturdays?" She said the gym was less crowded on weekends. Made sense to shift her schedule when work got busier, easier to focus. That explanation worked. Technically, I didn't push. I filed it. The phone thing escalated. Not dramatically. She wasn't sprinting to another room to take calls. But she'd gotten into the habit of taking her phone to the bathroom. At night, it was face down on the nightstand closest to her, and it stayed that way. She'd started using a passcode where she hadn't before, which she mentioned offhandedly one day as if it was obvious. I updated the security settings on my phone. You should too. There was something about data breaches at work. Which, sure, that's a completely valid reason to put a passcode on your phone. She was good, I'll give her that. Every single thing had a justification, a real, plausible, perfectly reasonable justification. That's what made it so difficult to hold on to. You'd grab one thing and it would slip through your hands because the explanation made logical sense. You couldn't argue with the explanation. You could only notice how many explanations there were, stacked neatly on top of each other like a wall. Individually, nothing. Together? Not great. She became more attentive to her appearance. Again, normal, women refresh their style, update their routines. But this had a specific quality to it. It was pointed outward, not inward. When someone starts caring more about how they look for themselves, there's a relaxedness to it. When someone starts caring more about how they look for someone else, there's an edge, a precision. Hannah had the edge. She got her hair done more often, started buying clothes more regularly, things I didn't always see her wear. She smelled different, a new perfume, introduced around the same time as the gym schedule change. She mentioned she'd been experimenting with a new skincare routine. I nodded along to all of it. She also stopped asking about my day. Not entirely, she wasn't obvious about it, but the quality of her attention had shifted. She was present in the way someone is present when they're doing something out of obligation rather than interest. You can feel the difference. It's subtle, but it's there. We were also, to put it plainly, less intimate. Another thing that had a ready explanation. Work stress, busy schedules, just being tired. All reasonable, all true probably. All also consistent with someone who was getting their emotional needs met somewhere else and therefore had less to bring home. I kept thinking about Derek, not because I had anything concrete on him. I didn't even know what he looked like. But Hannah had mentioned him exactly once in passing and then never again. And people don't do that with colleagues who are truly unremarkable. They mention them occasionally. They tell a funny story about something they said in a meeting. They come up naturally. The absence of someone is sometimes more notable than their presence. I did something I'm not entirely proud of. One evening in late July while Hannah was in the shower, I picked up her laptop, which she'd left open on the kitchen counter, and glanced at her email. I wasn't trying to dig. I was testing myself, honestly. Seeing if there was anything obvious I was missing. There wasn't anything obvious. The inbox looked normal. Work threads, some personal emails, a few newsletters. But I noticed the sent folder had been cleared. Completely empty. On a laptop she used regularly for work. People clear sent folders for a reason. Usually that reason isn't tidiness. I put the laptop down, didn't touch anything else. In August, we had dinner with a group of friends, 4 other couples we'd known for a few years. Hannah was in a good mood, funny, charming, doing the thing she does where she makes everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. She was good at that, genuinely good at it. At one point during the evening, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, and for exactly 1 second, her expression changed, not dramatically. Just a small, involuntary softening, the kind your face does before you've told it what to do. Then she set the phone face down, said something to the person next to her, and laughed. I was the only one who saw it. I was the only one watching for it. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was spiraling. I wasn't. I was just processing. Running through everything methodically, the way I do when I'm trying to figure out if I'm building something or following something. I kept arriving at the same place. I wasn't building anything. I was following something, and it kept leading back to a name I hadn't heard in months. A name she'd introduced once, casually, with the specific energy of someone who wants something to seem unremarkable. I'd been wrong before. I was very aware of that. But I also knew the gym situation had been nothing. No sustained patterns, no accumulation, no weight of consistent evidence. Just a single suspicious scenario that fell apart under the mildest scrutiny. This was different. This had been building for months. This had layers. This had a structure. That explanation came a little too prepared. The prepared explanations were what finally convinced me. Every time I'd asked something, casually, not accusatorially, the response came back just a little too smooth. Not hesitant, not defensive, just polished, ready. The way answers are when someone has already anticipated the question and preloaded the reply. Normal people sometimes stumble when asked about their day. Normal people say, "Oh, I don't know, just the usual, a meeting, lunch, nothing interesting." They're a little vague because they haven't been rehearsing. Hannah wasn't vague. Hannah was specific and organized and always had exactly the right level of detail. Enough to satisfy, not enough to invite follow-up. She'd gotten really good at this. The question was how long she'd been practicing. I want to be clear about something before I get into this part. I'm not a private investigator. I wasn't running some elaborate surveillance operation. I didn't hire anyone, plan anything, or go through her belongings. What I found because I was paying attention, and because Hannah, for all her careful construction, had made a few small errors that she didn't know I'd noticed. People who think they're managing a situation perfectly tend to get comfortable. Comfort creates sloppiness, and sloppiness, even minor, leaves traces. The first concrete piece came in September. Hannah had mentioned one Thursday evening that she was going to a colleague's birthday dinner. Someone named Cassidy from her team said it would probably run until 10 or so, told me not to wait up. Normal enough. I said fine. She left around 6:30. I wasn't planning to verify it. I genuinely wasn't. But I remembered that Cassidy, I'd heard the name before, she'd come up a few times in Hannah's work stories, had a public Instagram. I checked it on a whim, not expecting anything. Cassidy had posted that night 2 photos from what was clearly a birthday dinner. A group at a restaurant table, smiling, drinks raised, 5 or 6 people. Hannah wasn't in either photo. Now that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Not everyone appears in every photo. Hannah could have stepped away when the pictures were taken. She could have been in the bathroom. She could have arrived after the photos or left early. Except there were also Instagram stories from multiple people at that dinner, posted throughout the evening, and Hannah appeared in none of them. Still not definitive, still explainable, but it stacked. When she came home that night, I asked how the dinner was. "So fun," she said. Cassidy was so happy. "Where'd you guys go?" "That Italian place on 5th. You know, the one with the outdoor patio?" She gave me the restaurant name. I looked it up the next morning. The place existed. The reviews were fine. I couldn't verify she was or wasn't there. But I'd asked about it the next morning, casually, and mentioned a detail. I looked it up, looked like a nice spot, and watched her response. She didn't register any surprise that I'd looked it up. She just agreed it was a nice place, mentioned the pasta, moved on, clean, practiced. Yeah, that wasn't a coincidence. The second piece came in early October, and this one was harder to explain away. I'd gotten into the habit of paying closer attention to timing. Not obsessively, I wasn't tracking her with a stopwatch. But I knew roughly how long her commute was, roughly what a normal late evening at the office would look like, roughly what the timing should add up to. One Tuesday she told me she'd be late, working on a pitch deadline, probably not home until 9. She got home at 9:45. Nothing alarming about that, but her car was dry. It had been raining since 5:30, not a drizzle, a steady actual rain. Her car was parked on the street, no garage. When she walked in, her hair had slight frizz from the moisture in the air, but her coat was completely dry. Her car had been driven recently enough that it should have picked up rainwater on the windshield, the hood, the roof. Instead, it looked like it had been parked somewhere, covered for the last several hours, and driven over just before she pulled up to the house. She'd been somewhere with covered parking. I didn't say a word. I handed her the tea I'd made, asked how the pitch was coming, listened to the answer. At that point, it stopped being a feeling. The third piece, the one that closed it, came 2 weeks later. I've mentioned Hannah kept her phone locked and close. But people get comfortable with their phones the way they get comfortable with everything, when they feel like they've covered their tracks. Late one night, she fell asleep on the couch, watching TV. Her phone was on the cushion beside her, unlocked, screen still active. I wasn't snooping. I was walking past her to go to bed, and I saw the screen. It was a text thread. I only saw a few seconds of it before the screen timed out. The name at the top of the thread was saved as D Creative. The last visible message, sent from Hannah, read, "Can't wait. Thursday." That was it. Screen went dark. I stood in the living room for a moment. Then I went to bed. I lay there in the dark for a long time, not feeling what I expected to feel. I expected devastation. I expected some kind of wave to hit me. Instead, it was more like a flat, quiet settling. Like when you've suspected something for a long time and confirmation arrives and your body already processed the grief months ago without telling you. D. Creative. Derek, creative director. I hadn't been building a case. I'd been following a trail. I spent the next few days thinking carefully about what I actually knew versus what I'd inferred. I've always been methodical by nature. It's part of why I'm good at logistics. You don't move things without knowing what you're moving, where it's going, and what happens if something goes wrong. You map it out. What I knew for certain, Hannah had a text thread with someone labeled D. Creative. She was excited about seeing this person on Thursday. She had been lying about her whereabouts on at least one occasion with a birthday dinner that she may not have attended, and she had been somewhere with covered parking on a rainy Tuesday when she claimed to be working late. What I strongly suspected but couldn't yet prove. Derek from her agency was the person in question. This had been going on for months, and the entire architecture of late nights, work excuses, and careful schedule management had been constructed around facilitating it. I needed to fill in the gaps before I did anything else. I didn't want to act on partial information. Not because I was giving her the benefit of the doubt at this point. That door had pretty much closed. But because I wanted to understand the full picture before I decided what to do with it. I wanted to know the shape of the thing I was dealing with, so I waited, and I watched. And I started filling in what I didn't yet know. The thing about discovering your marriage is built on something rotten is that it changes your relationship with time, not in a sentimental way. More practically. Suddenly, every moment has a different weight, not because it's precious, but because it's information. Every conversation, every excuse, every small lie she tells adds to a picture. I wasn't angry yet. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect anger at this stage. I was past anger, or maybe I hadn't gotten there yet. Either way, what I felt was an almost clinical detachment, like I'd been handed a problem to solve and the emotions would have to wait until I'd solved it. I gave myself 4 weeks. The first thing I did was establish what I actually knew about Derek. LinkedIn made that easy enough. Hannah's agency had a team page, and there was a Derek Callahan listed as creative director. Mid-30s, Columbus-based, professionally accomplished, recently divorced based on a few small social media details I found without much effort. Recently divorced, of course. The situation practically wrote its own caption, but I wasn't interested in writing captions. I was interested in building a complete picture. The second thing I did was pay attention to Thursdays specifically, because that was the day Hannah had been excited about in the text I'd seen. Over the following 2 weeks, I noted what she told me on those days and what the timing actually looked like. First Thursday, she said she was staying late for a client call, got home at 9:15. The timing was a bit short for a full evening, but she seemed relaxed in a specific way, the way someone seems when they've had a good time and are trying to regulate back to baseline. Second Thursday, she said she was going to the gym after work, got home at 8:40, fresh shower smell, hair slightly different than the morning. The gym closes at 8 on weekdays. She lives 20 minutes from the gym, 20 minutes from the gym to our house. The math didn't work even slightly. She was very confident about the gym story. I'll give her that. I also did something practical that I'd been putting off for no good reason. I checked our joint credit card statements, not with any specific expectation, just looking for patterns. What I found was interesting, not flagrant. There were no hotel charges or anything that obvious, but there were consistent charges on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at a restaurant downtown. Modest amounts, drink and appetizer range, consistently those 2 days, consistently after 6 p.m. I looked up the restaurant. It was a wine bar 2 blocks from her agency. A wine bar with a covered parking garage attached to the building. There it was. I sat with the complete picture for a moment. 2 evenings a week reliably for what looked like several months based on the statements. A covered garage that explained why her car had been dry on a rainy Tuesday. A recently divorced creative director who worked in her building. 6 months of careful lies, each one individually reasonable, collectively a full-time management project. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wanted to hear how far she'd take it. Because here's what I'd decided. I wasn't going to have a confrontation that turned into a negotiation. I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to control the narrative, minimize what had happened, reframe it, turn it into a conversation about us and what we were missing and whether we could fix it. I'd watched enough people go through this to know exactly how that conversation goes. And it almost never ends with the truth being acknowledged clearly and cleanly. It ends with confusion, with half admissions, with the wronged party somehow ending up on the defensive. That wasn't going to be my experience. So I started planning. The first part of the plan was simple. I needed to decide what I wanted. Not what I wanted to say to her, not how I wanted the confrontation to go, what I actually wanted for my life on the other side of this. And when I sat with that question honestly, the answer was cleaner than I expected. I didn't want to fix the marriage. I want to be direct about that because I think it's important. There's a version of this story where a husband discovers his wife is cheating and his primary goal is to save the relationship. That wasn't me. Maybe it would have been different if we'd had kids, or if the marriage had felt truly close for the last year, or if there'd been some version of this I could explain as a single terrible mistake. But 6 months of constructed lies isn't a mistake. 6 months is a choice. Repeated, sustained, deliberate. What I wanted was out, cleanly, with full clarity about what had happened. Without drama, without extended negotiation, without giving her the opportunity to make this about anything other than what it was. The second part of the plan was about timing and audience. Hannah had a particular type of confidence. She was smart, strategic, and she was very aware of how she presented herself to the people around her. Her family, our mutual friends, her colleagues. She managed all of those relationships carefully. She'd invested years into a reputation for being grounded, thoughtful, the kind of person who made good choices. I wanted the confrontation to happen in a context where that careful reputation management was fully visible. Not to humiliate her, that wasn't the point. But because I knew that if it happened in private, without witnesses, the story would belong to whoever told it first and most convincingly. And Hannah was a marketing professional. She'd have been working on her version long before I had a chance to establish mine. I had one advantage she didn't know I had. She didn't know I knew. She'd been operating on the assumption that I was exactly where she wanted me. Slightly oblivious. Conditioned by the gym incident 2 years earlier not to trust my instincts, and generally too steady and non-confrontational to dig. She'd built her entire operation on that assumption. I was going to let her keep believing it for a little while longer. I started putting together the practical pieces of leaving. Not conspicuously, I wasn't moving furniture out of the house, but I quietly organized my finances. I'd always maintained a personal savings account separate from our joint account. Not out of secrecy, just habit, and I shifted more of my regular deposits there. I contacted a divorce attorney for an initial consultation, explained the situation, got a clear picture of what the process would look like. I looked into transfer opportunities within my company. I worked for a logistics firm with offices in multiple cities, and I'd been on good professional standing for years. A transfer was realistic. I started exploring what that would look like without officially requesting anything yet. I also called my older brother, Carter, who lived in Denver, and told him what was happening. Just him, nobody else. I needed one person to know, someone outside the situation who I trusted completely and who wouldn't tell anyone in our social circle. Carter was quiet for a moment after I explained it, then said, "What do you need?" I said, "I might need a place to be for a few weeks while I sort out the logistics." He said, "Done." That was all I needed. The final piece was the confrontation itself. I'd decided I wanted witnesses, but not many. Not a staged scene, not something theatrical. Just enough that the conversation couldn't be rewritten afterward. I settled on a dinner with Hannah's sister, Meredith, and her husband, who we got together with every 6 weeks or so. Close enough to Hannah to matter, not close enough to me to be seen as my ally. I set up the dinner for a Saturday evening in early November, normal enough that Hannah wouldn't think anything of it. I spent the week before that dinner watching her go through her routines. She was still careful, still smooth, still maintaining the whole architecture. She had absolutely no idea anything had changed. She was very confident. I'll give her that. It almost would have been impressive if it wasn't so obvious. The Friday before the dinner, she asked me over breakfast what I wanted to do for the holidays. Christmas was coming. We usually alternated between families. I said, "Let's figure it out next week." She nodded, refilled her coffee, looked at her phone. I looked at her for a moment and thought, one more day. Saturday came. Meredith and her husband Craig arrived at 7. Hannah had cooked, which she did well and enjoyed doing for company. The evening started normally. Drinks in the living room, easy conversation, the comfortable rhythm of people who know each other reasonably well. Hannah was relaxed. She'd had a good week, apparently. She was warm, funny, fully present in the way she always was with an audience. Meredith was laughing at something she'd said. Craig was talking about something work-related with me. I was calm. Genuinely. Not the performed calm of someone holding something in, actual calm. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're going to do and having already made peace with it. We sat down for dinner. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down and said, "I actually need to talk about something." The table shifted. Meredith looked at me. Craig stopped mid-sentence. Hannah's expression went from relaxed to attentive in a practiced, smooth way, the way she moved her face when she was preparing to manage something. I said, "Hannah, I know about Derek." Just that. Clean, no preamble. Her face did something she couldn't control. A fraction of a second where the management slipped completely and what was underneath, shock, calculation, a fast-moving calculation, was visible. Then it was back under control. She said, "What?" Her voice was level, impressive. I said, "I know about the wine bar on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I know about the conference in Cincinnati that wasn't really a conference. I know about Cassidy's birthday dinner you weren't at." Meredith had gone very still. Hannah said, "Tyler, I don't know what you think. You don't have to explain anything. I'm not asking for an explanation. I wanted Meredith here because I wanted at least one person from your family to hear this directly from me, not from a version of it you put together later." That landed. I watched it land. Hannah's expression shifted again, something harder underneath the shock now. She said, "This is not the place for," I said, "I've already spoken to an attorney. I've already organized what I need to organize. I'm not here to fight, and I'm not here to negotiate. I just wanted to be clear about what happened." Craig said something quiet to Meredith. Meredith was looking at Hannah with an expression I didn't have a clean word for. Not quite accusatory, not quite surprised, like maybe this wasn't completely out of nowhere for her. That was interesting. Hannah looked at me for a moment, and something in her posture shifted. The management came back, smoother now, more deliberate. She said, "Tyler, I think you've made some assumptions that." I said, "Creative. That's how you had him saved. I saw the thread." Silence. She stared at me. Then something else happened. Something I hadn't entirely predicted. She sat back in her chair, and for just a moment she dropped the whole architecture. Not with remorse, exactly. More with something that looked like recalibration. Like she was deciding which version of this to go with now that the first version wasn't viable. She said slowly, "What do you want from me, Tyler?" "Nothing," I said. "That's what I'm telling you. I don't want anything. I'm telling you how this is going to go." Meredith said, "Hannah, just the name." Her voice had something in it I'd never heard before when she talked to her sister. Hannah looked at her. Something passed between them that I wasn't meant to understand. Then Hannah looked back at me and said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you." I let that sit for a moment. "I know that. That almost makes it worse." She didn't say anything to that. I said, "You'll hear from my attorney Monday." I stood up, put my napkin on the table, and thanked Craig and Meredith for coming. Then I went upstairs, picked up the bag I'd packed that morning, and left. She called my name once from the bottom of the stairs. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Stripped of the management, stripped of the performance. Just her voice. I didn't answer. I got in my car and drove to a hotel I'd booked 2 days earlier. And that's where most of these stories end, right? There's a revelation, the closing of a door. Clean enough. Final enough. But this one has a second act. Because Hannah, to her credit, wasn't someone who gave up easily on things she'd decided she wanted. It just turned out that what she wanted had changed. I filed the papers on Monday, as promised. She didn't contest them immediately, which surprised me, but the attorney said it wasn't unusual. Sometimes people needed a few weeks to process before deciding how to respond. I stayed at the hotel for 10 days. Then I contacted HR at my company about the transfer opportunity I'd been quietly researching. They had an opening in their Denver office. Operations director role, actually a step up from my current position. They seemed pleased I was interested. I'd apparently been on a short list for advancement anyway. I said yes. I called Carter. "I'm taking you up on that," he said. "Room's ready." I gave notice on the house. It was technically in both our names, which would be sorted through the divorce process, but I wasn't going back to live there. Hannah had moved back in, and that was fine. Let her have it. I didn't want a house with 6 months of careful lies baked into the walls. I packed what mattered. Not a lot, as it turned out. Clothes, some books, my laptop, Scout. I was not leaving Scout. Hannah fought me on that briefly through the attorneys. Then she didn't. I don't know why. Maybe she decided it wasn't worth it. Maybe Meredith talked to her. Either way, Scout rode shotgun to Denver, which I think he enjoyed more than either of us expected. I arrived in Denver in early December, moved into Carter's spare room, started the new job after New Year's. And something happened that I want to be honest about because I think it's an important part of the story. I was okay. Not in a performed way. Not in a look how well I'm doing way. Just genuinely, quietly, surprisingly okay. The new role was more demanding than my previous job, which was good. It filled up the space. Denver was different from Columbus in ways that felt like breathing room. The mountains were there every time I looked north. Carter's wife Joanna was kind and unobtrusive in exactly the right way, asking only the questions that needed asking. I started running in the mornings, which I hadn't done in years. Joined a climbing gym in January because Carter was into it, and I needed something new to learn. Got slowly terrible at it, then gradually less terrible. Scout loved Denver. He'd been a Columbus suburb dog his whole life, and suddenly he had hiking trails on weekends. I was rebuilding something. Slowly, without forcing it, without turning into a narrative about reinvention or transformation. Just making a life that was mine, organized around what I actually wanted, without the layer of glass. The divorce finalized in March. Straightforward, ultimately. No kids, assets divided cleanly, no real fighting about any of it. Hannah had been cooperative in a way that felt like she was trying to manage her conscience as much as anything else. She could keep the house if she bought out my portion of the equity. She agreed. I used my portion as a down payment on a condo near Sloan's Lake. Moved in April. Furnished it simply. It had good light and a small balcony where Scout could supervise the neighborhood. I had not spoken to Hannah since the night I left. A few texts through the process. Purely logistical. Nothing personal. I was not angry. That's the thing I kept noticing. I'd expected to cycle through anger at some point, to have it catch up with me. It never really did. What I felt instead was something more like relief. The slow, expansive relief of having set down something heavy and not needing to pick it up again. April turned into May. Work was going well. I'd made some actual friends in Denver. Slowly, without effort. Colleagues who turned into people I got drinks with occasionally. A neighbor in my building, a guy named Marcus, who'd moved from Chicago around the same time for similar reasons and found the whole thing darkly funny in a way that I appreciated. Hannah reached out in late May, not through the attorneys, through my personal number, which she still had. The text said, "Tyler, I know this is probably unwanted. I just need to know you're all right." I looked at it for a while. Then I put the phone back down and went back to what I'd been doing. She texted twice more over the following 2 weeks. The second one said she'd heard from Meredith that I'd moved to Denver. Said she hoped the move had gone well. Said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. The third one said, "I made a mistake. I think I knew it almost immediately after you left, and I haven't stopped knowing it since. I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't want you to not know that I know." I read all of them. I didn't respond to any of them. It's not that I was punishing her. It wasn't spite. It was more that I'd genuinely arrived somewhere she wasn't relevant to. The version of me that had needed her to understand what she'd done, needed her to feel the weight of it, needed the acknowledgement. That version had processed its grief somewhere in the months between November and April and quietly let it go. By the time her texts arrived, I was already somewhere else. The thing about people who hand you divorce papers with a smirk is that they've decided you're the one who needs this relationship more. They've built their confidence on the assumption that your life requires them in it, that without them you'll unravel, that they are the structural element and you are what gets supported. Hannah had been very certain about that. Turns out she'd miscalculated. She called in June. Once, I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. I know because I looked at the timestamp before I decided whether to listen. I listened once. She said she'd ended things with Derek not long after I left. That she'd realized, apparently, that whatever she'd thought she was building in that direction wasn't actually what she'd wanted. That she'd confused feeling seen by someone new with something more meaningful than it was. That the distance he'd put between them after the situation became complicated at work had clarified things in an unpleasant way. She said living in the house alone was strange. She said she'd been in therapy for the first time in her life. She said she didn't know what she expected from this call. She said, "I miss you. I know that's probably not useful, but I do." Then she said she hoped I was happy, and she hung up. I sat in my living room in my condo in Denver, in the life I'd built in 6 months, with Scout asleep at my feet and the evening light coming in from the balcony, and I thought about everything she'd said. Then I deleted the voicemail and made dinner. She found my new address, I assumed through Meredith, who knew where I lived, and sent a letter in late June. An actual handwritten letter, which was not something Hannah had ever done in the time I'd known her. She was not a handwritten letter person. The fact that she'd written one suggested she understood that every digital channel had been effectively closed and was trying something that felt harder to ignore. I'll give her credit for the effort. The letter was honest. Not performed honest, which was her default register, actually honest, in a way that cost her something to write, I think. She said she'd spent 6 months reconstructing what she'd been thinking, what she'd been avoiding, what she'd been running toward, and away from simultaneously. She said she understood now that the late nights and the covered tracks and the careful architecture of misdirection hadn't been about Derek at all. Not really. That Derek had just been the place where she'd put something she hadn't been willing to sit with. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She said she'd settle for me knowing she understood what she'd done. She asked once if there was any version of a conversation I'd be willing to have. Not about reconciliation, just a conversation. Then she said she'd leave it there, and she wouldn't contact me again. I read the letter twice. I put it in a drawer. I did not respond. Not because I was cold about it. Not because I wanted her to keep suffering. But because I knew, clearly, without anger, without residual bitterness, that there was no version of that conversation that served either of us. She needed to be forgiven so she could move on. I understood that, but I wasn't the one who needed to provide it. She was going to have to find her way to that on her own, through her therapist or her sister or time or whatever combination of things works for people. What I knew was simpler. The life I'd built in the 6 months since November was genuinely mine in a way the 6 years before hadn't been, not entirely. Not because Hannah had been a bad person in all the ways she could have been, but because I'd been organizing my life around someone else's architecture for so long that I'd lost track of what I'd actually built for myself. Denver had given me that back. The new role, the running, the climbing gym, Marcus from Chicago with his dark humor, Scout on hiking trails on weekends, the condo with its good light. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even particularly triumphant, which I think surprises people when I tell this story. I was just done. And done, as it turns out, is the most peaceful thing you can be. That was 6 months after she handed me the papers. She'd handed them to me on a Thursday evening in October. I remember the exact moment. She'd come home from work, set her bag down, and turned to face me in the kitchen with that expression. Prepared. Certain. The smirk that said she knew how this scene ended. She'd placed the papers on the kitchen counter and slid them toward me without saying anything. I'd looked at them. Then I'd looked at her. Then I'd picked up a pen from the counter, signed where I needed to sign, and slid them back. I remember the exact second the smirk changed. The certainty behind it flickered, just slightly. She'd expected hesitation, shock, questions. She'd expected me to ask what this was about, to push back, to negotiate, to perform whatever version of devastation she'd been waiting for. Instead, I signed them and set the pen down and said, "Okay, I'll have my attorney call yours." And then I went upstairs. I didn't beg, I didn't break. I didn't give her the scene she'd built the whole moment around. At the time, I think she read it as shock, as the quiet before the inevitable collapse. What it actually was, clarity. I'd had months to process the grief before she handed me those papers. By the time they arrived, I was already on the other side of it. She'd handed me the exit and I'd walked through it. She wanted power over the ending. What she didn't know was that I'd already written it. I think about that smirk sometimes. Not with bitterness, more with something like analytical interest. The confidence behind it came from a specific belief that she was the story's author and I was a character in it. That she understood the scene and I was just responding. The smirk was the face of someone who'd already decided how things work. The thing about people who've decided they know how things work is that they stop watching for evidence to the contrary. They stop updating. They stay confident right up until the moment the evidence surprised. Hannah was genuinely surprised. Which, honestly, said more about her assumptions than anything else. At that point, there wasn't really anything left to say. I wasn't angry anymore. Just done, and done was enough.